All right, folks, thank you so much for tuning into this very short overview of the LuxTen or Luxembourg Negative Emissions Tariff Policy. This is actually a breakdown of the bill that has been introduced and will shortly be revised to reflect some of the components that I'm about to go over. So I'm just going to explain to you in some detail here where the LuxTen came from in terms of its basic policy inspiration and what it consists of in terms of specific policy mechanisms. So to begin with, it's key to point out that the main objective here that we work backwards from was that we want to establish Luxembourg as a leader in the emerging carbon dioxide removal sector and to put it into a position where it can play an important role in this evolving market. In terms of the sub-objectives, if we break that down a little bit, the goal of this policy is to provide demand support to accelerate CDR project demonstration and deployment, both within Luxembourg and globally. And in the process of doing so, meet a core global objective of driving down the cost of very promising high magnitude potential CDR pathways, but those which are currently very expensive. And then another really core value that's embedded within the bill that you'll see is the idea of democratizing CDR ownership and investment. So to construct a policy that allows a variety of different people, from individuals and households all the way up to large industrial players. Let's make a policy here that's designed in such a way that allows all sorts of different actors to play a role in the financing and realization of projects. Now, what the LuxTen is, as I referenced at the beginning, it's a negative emissions tariff. And I'll explain to you what that means by reference to the policy that it's most inspired by. And that is the renewable energy feed-in tariff, a policy that was momentously important, if that's a term, in the accelerating the deployment of renewable energy technologies, particularly solar and wind, during the first couple decades of this century. It's a policy that will be familiar to many folks who are renewable energy followers, particularly within the European context. It was initially introduced in Germany in the first couple of years of this century, but then was adapted and replicated in up to 40 different countries all over the world, particularly within the European Union. And again, it was critically important in ramping up deployment of renewable energy and driving down cost. If there's any single policy, there were many policies global, but if there's one that you wanted to point to that was the most important in making renewable energy economic, it was the feed-in tariff. And what it is, it's a payment system. It paid renewable energy project developers for their electricity at a premium rate based on their production. So if you're producing kilowatt hours of electricity and putting it on the grid, you would be paid for it. So at its core, that agreement is what a feed-in tariff is built around. And the tariff, or the level of payment, was based on what are the cost of the actual projects in the current time in which the policy is operating. And can we make sure that project developers are compensated through this tariff based on what the cost of their projects are, plus a reasonable rate of return? And that payment that they would get for generating and putting clean electricity onto the grid, they would be able to engage in a multi-year fixed price contract. So it wasn't just a single year that they'd be paid for, but in the case of renewables, it was typically 15 to 20 years that you would lock into that contract period being paid at the particular price that you locked in with. And a key element of the feed-in tariff is that it didn't just pick a single renewable energy technology, but there were a variety of different technologies that were eligible to participate in the program, solar and wind, but as well as some other renewable energy technologies. And the LuxTen draws from that in that it's proposing, just like a renewable energy feed-in tariff, performance-based payments for removing carbon and, in some cases, storing it. And similarly, the tariff that will be awarded to project owners will be based on the total cost of the project. But as I'll show in just a few moments, it has a couple of elements to it that help us get to that number, such as what is the technology category, what type of technology, different technologies have different costs. Does the technology remove carbon plus store it, or does it just remove it? And are there other benefits as well that can be quantified that are desirable for Luxembourg and globally that can be determine additional payment levels for projects? And in this case, we're going for a 5-year fixed price contract rather than a 15-20. And part of that is because carbon dioxide removal technologies are at a much earlier stage than solar and wind, and we expect a higher level of obsolescence. So what this does is it's a shorter contract period so that we don't lock in and increase payments over long periods of time when the technology is continuing to evolve, where obsolescence is a And as I said, alluded to just a moment ago, projects that sign up or participate in the program, they can be carbon removal and utilization projects. So projects that pull carbon from the air and then use it for some economically and climate beneficial purpose. Or it could be for projects that pull carbon out of the air and durably or for a long period of time store that carbon dioxide removal. The focus is to deploy many different types of projects in Luxembourg and all over the world, but on a smaller distributed scale. So there's actually the maximum amount of carbon dioxide removal capacity for an eligible project is 10,000 tons of metric carbon removed per year. And projects can be located actually anywhere in the world, including in Luxembourg, provided that there's at least a minimum 50% ownership stake by a Luxembourg-based entity. And the funding for this project, critically, unlike a feed-in tariff, which was funded through small fees that were added to ratepayer electricity bills, this would actually draw from an existing climate innovation fund that Luxembourg already has in place, which is actually quite undersubscribed. So here we're taking a particular pot of money that's available every year, and that will fund it. When those funds are exhausted in any given year, then the application period freezes until the following year when that fund is replenished. And the way that it works, as I mentioned before, there's a sort of a variety of factors that determine the price or the payment that any given project will have. And the way that we divide it is there's a price floor, which I'll say that's sort of a minimum price that a project will get paid. And then there's a stack of different characteristics that different projects will correspond to different features of a particular project. That's the technology category, the capacity or the size of the project in terms of the amount of carbon that it removes per year, whether or not it stores. If it stores carbon durably, then it gets an additional layer of payment. And then, as I'll elaborate in a moment, there are some bonus adders or bonus co-benefits that we think deserve additional payment, which I'll explain in just a moment. So how this works in practice, picking each of those parts, we're looking at the floor that the minimum payment that a project could pay could never go below what the Luxembourg carbon tax is during the year in which the contract starts. So currently that's around 20 euros per ton. And that will fluctuate over time, but that would be the baseline or the floor pricing. But every project is going to have these additional things stacked on it. So it would never be that a project would only have the carbon tax. That's just the minimum that all the other layers sit on top of. And the first one and the base is the technology category. This is a lot like the feed-in tariff, where different technologies, solar or wind, would have different starting base prices given what the prevailing cost is in the marketplace at that time. And this price can be discovered just like with the feed-in tariff requires market research and empirical analysis by the regulator year after year to determine where average prices are. So you could have a layer for direct air capture, for different forms of durable bio-based carbon removal, mineralization, et cetera. It will be up to the regulator to determine how they categorize that. So that's the base layer. And then the next one is what's the removal capacity? So here again, we want to democratize ownership, but we understand that smaller projects, capacity side, are likely to have higher installed costs. So for smaller projects, you would get a higher capacity layer in terms of your payment than you would for a larger project. So that would be split up by different capacity grades or bars. And then following that is the storage category, again, which would only be eligible to projects that are durably storing carbon dioxide, not just utilizing it for some sort of economic or climate beneficial purpose. And here you would have projects that have a longer demonstrated storage period. So let's say, for instance, 1,000 years or more would get paid more than projects that demonstrate, let's say, 100-year storage. So there's everybody who does storage gets paid, but you get paid more depending on the duration of the storage from your project. And next, we have what we call bonus adders that are meant to give additional payment for projects that deliver co-benefits or services that are not directly related to carbon removal, but do have an economic, environmental, or climate benefit. So in these cases, the regulator could say, well, we have a priority use case. Maybe we're really interested in projects that use forms of waste from the industrial environment and utilize that or repurpose it for carbon removal in a circular way. There could be a number of different things the regulator might identify as having a priority strategically for Luxembourg that year in, year out, they could add a special layer to. Community ownership. Again, this was a feature of many feed-in tariffs as well that would have an additional payment for this. But in the interest of that democratizing carbon removal, let's say there's a project that is cooperatively owned or owned by a particular community within Luxembourg or outside, that could get a additional layer as well. If it's a small to medium-sized enterprise, that might also have a different sort of tariff premium that's added onto it. And another that could be considered as well would be, again, this is a global program where projects can be located anywhere. Projects that are planned in countries where Luxembourg, through its development agency, LuxTen, might have a special relationship already in Africa or in Asia. If a project is located in those places, there might be an additional layer that's also added, or an additional payment. So just to give you an example, very, very simply here, you might have two projects next to each other in terms of where their tariff or the amount of money that they're going to get paid. Let's say you have a direct air capture project that's somewhere in the range of 2,500 to 5,000 carbon removal capacity per year, and it's owned by a community in Luxembourg. Okay, so you'd stack all those together and you'd get a certain rate that project would get paid each year for the 5-year contract period. Let's say you have a bikers or a BEX project that removes carbon. That might be a little bit less expensive as calculated by as determined by the regulator than the DAC project, but they might be able to demonstrate their project might be smaller, for instance, and have a 1,000 capacity, and that would be larger. So this just shows you how it would work, how different projects would ultimately get paid different levels. And there's many different iterations or configurations of this that we can consider based on different technologies, their location, size, ownership structure, etc. So that's a good overview, generally speaking, of how it works. Hopefully that makes sense. In the show notes, there is a contact form. So if you have questions and you're excited about this project or you just want to know more, please do reach out and we will be in touch. Thank you so much.